November 1, 1396. St. Paul's Cathedral in London stood bathed in candlelight. Hundreds of flames danced against its tall Gothic windows, as the pipe organ roared through the ancient halls. Down the central aisle, a royal procession made its way toward the altar. But this was no ordinary wedding. At the heart of the ceremony was a little girl, just 6 years old. Isabelle of France, Europe's youngest princess, walked solemnly toward her future husband, King Richard II of England. He was 29, dressed in golden silk that swept across the cold stone floor. Richard waited at the altar. Meanwhile, Isabelle struggled to carry the heavy crown perched on her small head. In just minutes, she would be declared Queen of England. Not because she chose it, but because this political marriage would help seal a fragile truce between two warring nations. But how did such a young child become the centerpiece of medieval diplomacy? To understand Isabelle's fate, we must go back to France specifically, the late 14th century, a kingdom haunted by war, madness, and betrayal. Isabelle was born on November 9, 1389, in the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the fourth daughter of King Charles VI of France, better known to history as Charles the Mad, and his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. Even from the beginning, her world was far from peaceful. Her father had suffered from terrifying bouts of insanity since he was 24. At times, he believed he was made of glass, and would shatter if touched. He ran through palace halls, screaming about invisible enemies. During his worst episodes, he didn't recognize his own wife or children. France, effectively leaderless, descended into chaos. Powerful regions battled each other for control, while the real king was imprisoned in his own broken mind. Isabelle's mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was no comfort. Cold and calculating, she used her husband's illness to amass power and wealth. Chroniclers of the time accused her of neglecting her children, keeping lovers, and thinking of her daughters as bargaining chip stools to seal alliances, not lives to nurture. In this toxic atmosphere, young Isabelle grew up. France itself was a battlefield, torn apart by the 100 Years' War with England, and by brutal internal conflicts between rival noble factions, the Armagnacs, and the Burgundians. In 1396, when Isabelle was just 6, opportunity knocked. England's King Richard II was seeking peace. After years of warfare, his kingdom was suffering. He'd recently lost his beloved wife, Anne of Bohemia, and the pressures of politics and rebellion were closing in around him. Richard needed an alliance, one that would calm tensions at home and buy peace abroad. The French saw a golden chance. Led by the Duke of Berry, French negotiators offered Isabelle as a bride. In exchange, England would receive peace, a 28-year truce, and an enormous dowry, £800,000 a fortune at the time. It was a cold, transactional deal. Months of talks followed, where French and English diplomats debated the child's fate as if she were livestock. Even by medieval standards, 6 was young for marriage. Some English advisors insisted they should wait until she was at least 12, the age when marriages could be consummated. But Richard was in a hurry. His throne was fragile, his enemies growing bolder. Political survival mattered more than propriety. The treaty was signed. Isabelle of France would become Queen of England. Her departure was more theatrical than tender. In a rare moment of clarity, King Charles VI blessed his daughter through tears. Her mother, ever detached, treated the entire affair as a successful political transaction. To her, it was simply another diplomatic win. Little Isabelle didn't grasp what was happening. For her, the journey to England felt like an adventure, maybe even a temporary one. She packed a few dolls, some toys, and her beloved lap dog. Hundreds of nobles and guards accompanied her across France. The mission was clear: deliver the most precious cargo in France to her new home. From Calais to London, her caravan was met with grand parades and royal receptions. English towns competed to host the most extravagant welcome. But beneath the gold and flowers, Isabelle was exhausted, homesick, and frightened. She often cried and begged to go back to Paris. When the royal party reached London, preparations were already complete. Richard II had planned one of the most magnificent weddings ever held in the kingdom. St. Paul's Cathedral was decorated with fabrics combining French and English heraldry. Thousands of candles glowed through the Gothic structure. Latin and French choirs filled the air with music. To the outside world, it was a glorious sign. Peace had been won through diplomacy. But to those who looked closely, something felt deeply wrong. Richard II, ever a patron of the arts, and a man of refinement, appeared solemn. He had loved his first wife deeply, and now he was about to marry a child. The awkwardness weighed heavily on him, but his political needs left him no choice. As for Isabelle, she said nothing during the entire ceremony. Overwhelmed by the foreign language, the massive crowd, and the sheer scale of the event, she stood frozen. The Archbishop of Canterbury had to kneel to place the ring on her tiny finger. She kept glancing around, searching for familiar faces. But none were there. When she was declared Queen of England, there were no smiles, only confusion and fear. In the beginning, her life in England was carefully protected. Richard treated Isabelle more like a daughter than a wife. He gave her tutors from France, allowed her to speak her native tongue, and surrounded her with a private household of ladies and servants. She lived in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, and even had a small estate of her own. For a while, it seemed like her childhood might be preserved at least in part. But peace, as always, was fragile. The stability of her new life would soon be torn apart, and her role as a political pawn was far from over. In the quiet halls of Westminster Palace, Isabelle of France lived in a strange kind of limbo. She was Queen of England, crowned in a cathedral that had echoed with choirs and candlelight. But in truth, she was still just a child, and her husband, King Richard II, treated her not as a wife, but as a daughter. For a time, this strange arrangement offered a fragile peace. Richard, though nearly 5 times her age, showed genuine kindness. He arranged for French-speaking tutors, allowed her to keep her native customs, and made sure she was treated with dignity. The court accommodated her as a royal guest, rather than a bride. Her chambers were richly furnished, and her every need met. But all of it was a carefully built illusion, one that wouldn't last. The kingdom around her was in turmoil, and the man she called husband was walking a knife's edge. Richard's rule had never been secure. His taxes were deeply unpopular. Nobles whispered behind his back. Old resentments simmered just beneath the surface. And in September 1399, it all came crashing down. While Richard was campaigning in Ireland, a powerful noble, Henry Bolingbroke, the exiled son of John of Gaunt, turned to England. Bolingbroke, later known as Henry IV, quickly gathered support from nobles and commoners alike. He marched across the country with growing force, claiming he only wanted his father's lands back. But it became clear that his ambitions were far greater. When Richard returned, he was met not with loyalty, but with silence. Many of his former allies had already pledged allegiance to Bolingbroke. Outnumbered and politically isolated, the king was captured and imprisoned. A month later, Parliament declared him unfit to rule. Richard II was deposed. Soon after, he was transferred to Pontefract Castle. There, in early 1400, the deposed king mysteriously died. The official cause was never declared. Some said he starved himself. Others believed he was murdered. He was 33 years old. At just 10 years old, Isabelle of France became a widow. She had never shared a true marriage bed, never experienced the intimacy that the title queen suggested, yet she wore the heavy burden of royalty, and now, that burden deepened. She had lost her crown, her husband, and any place in English politics. Worse still, her dowry, £800,000, was long gone, spent by Richard to stabilize his failing rule. Her marriage was technically incomplete. There were no children, and it had never been consummated. But diplomatically, it had been binding. Which raised a new question: what to do with the French princess? Returning her to France would mean returning the dowry, money that no longer existed. Henry IV, now King of England, had no intention of doing that. He saw Isabelle not as a grieving child, but as a valuable hostage. She was a bargaining chip in a diplomatic game that hadn't ended. Henry IV kept Isabelle under what could be described as comfortable captivity. She was sent to Havering Bower, a royal manor east of London. Her chambers were large. She had maids, tutors, and attendants. She was safe, but she was not free. For 3 years, Isabelle lived like this. A ghost queen, caught between 2 kingdoms. She had no contact with her homeland. No visits from friends. No idea when or if she would ever see her family again. Her letters from this time tell us everything we need to know about her inner world. "I write to you in tears," she told her father, Charles VI, "for I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of return." These were not the words of a child anymore. They were the words of someone who had been broken too early, forced to grow up under the crushing weight of politics. Eventually, her pleas reached their mark. In one of his rare moments of lucidity, Isabelle's father demanded her return. The French court, troubled by Henry IV's rise to power, and eager to reclaim some dignity, pressed hard for her release. Diplomatic pressure mounted. The new English king knew he couldn't keep her forever, but he needed to make sure that her return wouldn't reignite the flames of war. It took years of negotiations. Treaties were discussed, promises exchanged. But in 1401, the deal was finally made. Isabelle would return to France. At 12 years old, Isabelle stepped onto French soil again. But the girl who had left Paris at 6 was no longer the same. Her childhood was gone, robbed not by time, but by the machinery of monarchy. Her return wasn't met with celebration. The French royal family, still embroiled in civil unrest and power struggles, received her more as a burden than a daughter. Her value as a pawn had decreased. Her innocence, already spent. Isabeau of Bavaria, her mother, saw her less as a person than as a tool that had outlived its usefulness. There was no soft reunion, no fairy tale homecoming. France, like England, had little space for compassion. But Isabelle's tragedy wasn't finished. Even as she began to heal, to find stability in familiar surroundings, her fate was once again being written without her consent. In 1405, at the age of 16, she was told she would marry again. Her mother had arranged a match with Charles of Orléans, a young poet and nobleman. Another political marriage. Another alliance. But this time, fate gave her a brief reprieve. Charles was not a warrior king. He was thoughtful, sensitive, and literary. He had no hunger for domination or violence. And remarkably, he loved her. To everyone's surprise, Isabelle and Charles found genuine affection in each other's company. Their shared love for poetry and the arts brought them close. For the first time in her life, Isabelle was not being used as a pawn. She was truly seen as a person. Theirs was a quiet, tender relationship. Their time together short, but meaningful. At last, Isabelle knew what it was to be loved, not for her crown or her connections, but for her soul. But peace, as always, in her life, was fleeting. In 1405, Isabelle of France had found something she'd never known before: happiness. After years of being traded like a political commodity, married off as a child, imprisoned, forgotten, she had finally married a man who didn't treat her like a pawn. Charles of Orléans, a soft-spoken young poet and nobleman, offered her something she had never been granted before: affection, understanding, and choice. Their marriage, though arranged like so many others, quickly became something rare in royal circles, a genuine love match. Together, they found comfort in literature, music, and quiet moments away from the brutal chessboard of European politics. After the cold detachment of her first marriage to King Richard II, this new chapter must have felt like a revelation. But Isabelle's life had never been allowed to remain peaceful for long. Just 2 years later, history repeated itself in the cruelest way. In 1407, tragedy struck again. Charles of Orléans was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt. One of the most devastating military defeats France would ever suffer. The English victory marked a turning point in the 100 Years' War, and Charles, along with many other noblemen, was taken prisoner. He would remain in captivity for an astonishing 25 years. For Isabelle, it was as if a shadow had descended once more. Her second husband was gone, and with him, the fragile stability she had finally begun to build. She was still only 18. Though not officially a widow, she was alone again, politically vulnerable, emotionally devastated, and pregnant. In 1409, Isabelle gave birth to a daughter, Joan of Orleans. She was the only child Isabelle would ever have. Motherhood brought a bittersweet sense of purpose. Her daughter was a living symbol of the love she had found with Charles, but also a constant reminder of what she had lost. Even worse, Isabelle knew too well what the future likely held for Joan. As a royal girl, she would grow up not as her own person, but as someone else's political instrument. The same fate Isabelle herself had suffered. But Isabelle did her best. With Charles in captivity, she focused on raising Joan, sheltering her from the brutal world outside the palace walls. She remained active in the French court, though quietly. She offered counsel where she could, drawing on her years of painful experience to help guide others through the shifting tides of politics and diplomacy. For a while, it seemed she might find peace in her new role, as a mother, advisor, and quiet survivor. But Isabelle's story would not have a long final chapter. Later that same year, in 1409, Isabelle of France died. She was just 20 years old. The cause of death was postpartum complications, a cruel fate that claimed the lives of many young women in the medieval world of queens. There was no national mourning, no great funeral, no public grief. The same royal courts that had once celebrated her wedding with golden silks and 1,000 candles barely acknowledged her passing. She had done her duty. She had been used. And now, she was gone. Isabelle's life, when viewed from a distance, seems almost too tragic to be real. But every step of it was shaped by forces that were all too common in medieval Europe: the cold machinery of monarchy, the prioritization of politics over people, and the reduction of young girls to diplomatic assets. She was 6 years old when she was married to a king, 10 when she became a widow, 12 when she was returned to a homeland that barely remembered her, 16 when she was married, again this time to someone who finally saw her humanity, and 20 when she died, likely in pain, leaving behind a daughter who would grow up without knowing either parent. In that short span of years, Isabelle had been a child bride, a foreign queen, a political prisoner, a grieving widow, a mother, and a silent strategist in court politics. But never, not once, was she allowed to live simply for herself. Isabelle's story is more than just a personal tragedy. It forces us to look deeply at the brutal realities behind the glittering pageantry of royal life. For all the jewels, gowns, and titles, her life was defined by powerlessness. She had no control over her body, her home, or her future. Every decision was made for her by men, by councils, by treaties. She was passed from hand to hand like a sealed letter between kings, useful only so long as her name carried diplomatic weight. Even the joy she found with Charles of Orléans was temporarily interrupted by a war she had no part in, orchestrated by men who never once considered the lives they shattered with their choices. History barely remembers Isabelle. She is not one of the celebrated queens of France or England. She left no famous speeches, no decisive political actions. She didn't change the course of history with a dramatic gesture. But her life still speaks volumes. She was one of the countless royal women whose suffering was accepted as part of the price of peace. Girls like her were used as tools for treaties, for truces, for noble houses to secure wealth or power, and when they had served their purpose, they were quietly erased. Isabelle of France deserves more than that. Her life was short, but it carried the weight of empires. Her pain was personal, but born from systems of power that affected millions. Her silence wasn't consented, was the silence forced upon children, who are never given the right to speak. Isabelle of France died quietly, almost anonymously, in 1409. At just 20 years old, her life had come to an end, in the same way it had been lived, not with ceremony, but with silence. There were no public tributes, no royal funeral procession, no grand tomb for the child queen who had once been paraded through cathedrals under the flickering light of 1,000 candles. In the annals of European history, she barely left a mark. Yet her story has haunted those who choose to look closer, not because of the power she held, but because of how little she was ever allowed to hold. Isabelle's life is a study in sacrifice. Not the heroic, chosen kind, but the quiet, coerced kind that happens when a child is born into a palace and treated as a pawn the moment she can walk. At 6 years old, she was traded like a treasure chest. At 10, she was a widow for a man she never truly knew. At 12, she was treated as a diplomatic inconvenience, unwanted by her own court. At 16, she found a fleeting moment of love, and by 20, she was gone. Behind every treaty and royal alliance in medieval Europe, there were children like Isabelle used to hold empires together. Their lives weren't their own. Their worth was measured in dowries, titles, and bloodlines. The £800,000 given as her dowry was treated with more urgency than her emotional well-being. Her youth was not a source of protection, it was the very thing that made her useful to kings. The result was a life of trauma, forced maturity, and ultimately, erasure. There is a deep cruelty in the way Isabelle's life ended. She had done everything that was expected of her. She had fulfilled her diplomatic function. She had married for peace, endured captivity, and even given birth to an heir. Yet, when she died, the world barely noticed. History doesn't remember her like it remembers Joan of Arc or Eleanor of Aquitaine. She left no battlefield victories, no revolutions, no dynasties. But perhaps that's what makes her story so important. She represents the silent majority of royal women, those whose lives were shaped entirely by other people's decisions. Women who were born into privilege but stripped of choice. Women who served the crown not with a sword, but with their own bodies and futures. Her daughter, Joan of Orleans, was left motherless before her first birthday, and fatherless in practice. Since Charles of Orleans remained imprisoned in England for decades, we know little about how Joan was raised, or whether she ever truly knew what her mother had endured. Like many daughters of royalty, her life would almost certainly have followed the same pattern: a marriage chosen by others, a crown exchanged for peace, a life bartered behind closed doors. Isabelle likely knew this, and as much joy as Joan may have brought her, that joy was tinged with the sharp sorrow of watching history repeat itself. If you step back and ask, was it worth it? The answer depends on which part of history you listen to. To the kings and nobles of the late 14th century, Isabelle's marriage helped secure a 28-year truce between England and France. It was seen as a diplomatic triumph. Peace, however brief, was bought with her childhood. But peace doesn't always come cheap. And for Isabelle, the cost was everything: her freedom, her family, her happiness. She carried the weight of a crown that had no place on a child's head. She wore gold and silk and diamonds that couldn't shield her from grief, and she walked through palaces that felt more like prisons. Over 600 years have passed since Isabelle's brief life ended, and yet, her story still feels painfully modern, because child marriage isn't just a thing of the past. Because girls are still used to smooth political or social negotiations traded into unions they don't choose. Silenced for the sake of appearances, and told that obedience is noble. Isabelle's life forces us to look beyond the glitter of royalty and into the machinery that powers it. It reminds us that the most beautiful crowns can be forged from pain, control, and loss. And it teaches us a hard truth, that history's most fragile people are often the first ones forgotten. There is no grand statue of Isabelle of France. No famous painting. No preserved letters of legacy. But perhaps that is fitting. Because her legacy isn't built on monuments, it's built on memory. The kind of memory that whispers through stories like hers. The kind that survives when someone finally says aloud, "She mattered." Isabelle may not have ruled, but she reveals. She reveals what happens when innocence is sacrificed for empire. When childhood is exchanged for ceremony. When peace comes at the cost of the most vulnerable. In this way, she is not just a queen of the past, she is a symbol for every girl who's been silenced by systems too large to fight. When we remember kings, we often count their wars, their victories, and their legacies. But when we remember queens like Isabelle, we should count something else: the sacrifices they were never asked about. Her life, though short, forces us to confront the human side of politics, to look past the thrones and treaties, and ask, what is the cost of power, and who pays it? Isabelle of France paid with her life. Let her not be forgotten.